Right. Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and kick off the presentation tonight. So this is Justin Krause joining you with the Washington Retirement Planning Specialist. I first want to thank everyone for taking the time tonight to join us on what is truly one of the most important topics in our industry, which is identity theft and the privacy protection strategies and what can keep you safe and can keep us safe in the industry. Now today we have a very special guest joining us from Prudential to present on the topic, Mr. Ted Denbow, National Director, the Sales Technology Group. Ted has over 17 years of experience in the information technology sector with a focus on the financial services industry. Ted has worked on numerous projects to deliver web-based technologies to enhance the financial professional's experience in both the domestic and international marketplace. Ted has spent a large portion of time cultivating relationships with financial professionals while helping them to grow and to manage their business. In his efforts, Ted has presented across the country at broker-dealer conferences, roadshows, focus meetings, and in individual settings. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome one of the industry's leaders in the Sales Technology Group, Ted Denbow, to the presentation.
Thank you, Justin, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Justin mentioned, we're going to spend a little time tonight walking through some strategies and key points to keep in mind relating to identity theft and specifically protecting your information. We'll do that by covering three key points, what I like to call the 3 Ds of identity theft. That's deter, detect, and defend. As we go through the program tonight, please take note. Feel free to jot down any questions you may have, and at the end of my presentation, we'll have ample time for questions as we go through it. So I'm going to jump right in. I always like to start off with some interesting information. As you can all imagine, the Internet has led to a lot of the increase of identity theft and fraud over the years. What I think is important to point out is that it's actually not been around for very long. If you look up at the screen, you'll see that what we consider the Internet today, the W's, the World Wide Web, the WWWs, if you will, really just started in the early 90s, December 20th, 1990. It was launched by a group of physicists at a company called CERN in Europe. And you think about where this started in a very short period of time, not even 30 years ago, and you look at what it's turned into today. Right, and you think of the use today is astounding. 3 billion folks worldwide leverage the Internet on a day-to-day basis. In the U.S., we actually have one of the highest utilization rates in the world. As you can see, 87% of Americans are online on a regular basis. You think of the search engine Google, right? Google it is a common practice that people do, so there's no longer any arguments. There's no reason to dispute anything. When people have a question, they go right to their smartphone, to their tablet, to their computer, hop on Google, and you can find out just about anything. Now, when it comes to the validity of what you might find, that's where the real questions come into play. But with that broad reach and all that great experience comes a lot of vulnerability. You think about from an investor's perspective, out there, all of you have a lot of reach and leverage the web on a regular basis. You think of today with Social Security. You have to go online to check your Social Security information, and many folks leverage it as a primary communication point. But it also leads to a lot of concern and a lot of possible risk. And we look at some of the largest data breaches that have occurred, most of them occurred in the last few years. And they've happened to many companies, and it can be painful for those companies as well as their consumers, their members, their customers. But I think an important thing to point out as you look at this screen, it's not so much there to scare you with the large scope of numbers. It's to point out how the media tends to blend things so they sound interesting. And what I mean by that is if you look at some of the companies and size of the breaches out there, you think of Home Depot. I think we all heard about Target, eBay. My point here is those are accounts at each company And they tend to be a lot of people that have similar information at different companies. And what I mean by that is you have a large overlap of people that might have had data exposed to Home Depot versus eBay versus Target versus some of the other companies out there. So it's actually a little bit blown out of proportion. There's still possible risk out there, but I think as the media does with a lot of things, they tend to elaborate it a little further than it truly is. So there may be a lot of data out there, but there's also a lot you can do to protect yourselves. And that's what we're going to focus a lot here on tonight, is give you tips and tricks, things to look for, things to be aware of, because education is key. The more you know about what's going on, the more protected, the better prepared you can be. And we think about identity theft, the simplest way to describe it is it's basically the misuse of someone's personal information to commit fraud. It affects millions of people every year, unfortunately. It's not going away. The financial losses in the U.S. are quite astounding. As you can see on the screen, $24.7 billion in 2013. The average loss, nearly $5,000. But there's a lot of things you can do so that that doesn't happen to you. And one of them I always like to point out is there are areas where it's highly concentrated. And that's why we point out some of the states with the largest cases of identity theft complaints. And the reason we point that out, I'm sure many of you travel. And if you happen to be traveling around the U.S. or in Arizona, California, Florida, Texas, or Nevada, at least if you're aware of the fact that there's a lot of fraud and identity theft that occurs in those locations, you might want to be more mindful of monitoring your transactions and your accounts while traveling in those areas or while transactioning business in those areas. So again, being aware of it is one of the key points that you can take away and make sure you're staying on top of protecting your information. So we'll get into the first D, and that's deter. This is really focused on preventative measures that you can take to reduce your exposure. We're going to go into a lot of these in more detail to give you examples of how they're used against people and things you can do about it. You know, cleaning up your paper trail is a big theme you're going to see in the first few minutes. Destroying the paper before it ends up in the trash. Protecting your Social Security number. That's a challenge for a lot of folks because of different things that they have to use for it, but it's really never was it intended to be what it is today, meaning that when they first came out with our Social Security numbers, they weren't initially intended to be our unique identifier for everything. And you've actually seen most industries slowly start to migrate away from using them as your primary identifier. You may need to still use them for initial account setups, but for example, in financial services, no longer are you even allowed to use them as your usernames or even passwords when you create IDs and credentials for websites. That's because the risk of leveraging that number in too many places has been clearly identified, and slowly industries and segments are starting to pull away from it. And again, we'll touch on some password tips and other things you can do to keep your information safe. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of emphasis from the first D, deterring, around paper trails and reducing your paper trail. It's amazing how much information floats around out there. And I really like to emphasize this point because you think about your mailbox and how much comes and goes through your mailbox on a regular basis and the type of information that comes through there, right? There's, as you can see, 65 billion pieces of mail in 2013, and nearly 44% of that stuff never gets open as the junk mail. And then where does that end up? It ends up right in the trash in many cases. And a lot of that can be risky, especially when you think of stuff like credit card offers, account statements, transactional statements. Those are key things that you want to make sure you shred before they go in the garbage. Even if it's something that you think is not a high risk, like a credit card offer, that can be very risky, because if you've ever received one, and I'm sure many of you have and probably get them on a regular basis, on those, there's a lot of information that you need to fill out, but on the back of all the credit card offers is a little checkbox where if someone had enough information to fill out and respond to on you, they can check the box on the back to change the address of the recipient. And that allows them to then receive this new card to a different location. All correspondence will go to a different location, and you'll be none the wiser. So, again, it's incredibly important to shred and destroy anything, even if it seems relatively benign. And it's important to reduce that paper that comes to your mailbox. if and where you're comfortable, going to online-only access for stuff like statements, transactional documents from many of your financial institutions. All companies out there offer it, not just Prudential and our partners here, but all of your different companies give you an option. If you're comfortable, you can receive all your documents digitally through their website. And what that does is it actually reduces some of your possible exposure, because for someone to get in there, it's much more difficult to hack into a website than it is to actually go through your mailbox. And then the final point to note, if you do get a lot of credit card offers and you'd like to reduce some of those, a key thing to take note of, optoutprescreen.com is a great resource. You can go on there and actually choose to elect to no longer receive all the different offers you get. So again, reducing that paper trail that comes to your mailbox is one of the best things that you can do. Up until just a couple of years ago, most identity theft cases, meaning north of 60% of them, all originated from paper means. And to be honest, I think it's still a high percentage. It's just a matter of so much data has been out there now that it's started to go south of 50%. But it's still a tremendous exposure. And again, reducing that paper that comes into your mailbox is a very, very good thing to do to limit your risk. Another area is what you carry around in your wallet and your purse on your person. Many folks, and even myself in the past, we used to carry around our Social Security cards. You know, sometimes if you're traveling, you might carry a blank check in case you needed access to funds. Maybe you forgot to pull out an expired credit card, might have some receipts. I've even seen some folks that have their passwords and even spare keys in their wallets. And if you think about all of that combined with your driver's license and any other information that you would normally need in your wallet and on your person, that could be a high risk if you happen to lose it or it happens to get stolen. So again, reducing what you have in there is an important thing. Like your Social Security card, I know many folks don't, but many folks still do carry it around with them. And in day-to-day lives, you typically don't need it on you. Another one that is a challenge for many folks that are retired these days is your Medicare IDs. As I'm sure those of you that have them, you're probably familiar with the fact that it is your Social Security number with a letter in front of it. Well, that can be a challenge. You may want to have that on your person at all times. So a little tip that I've seen many folks do is they'll make a photocopy of their Medicare ID and white out the actual number because they can remember their Social Security number. So again, little things like that can make a big difference. Another scam that's been happening more and more, and this is thieves taking advantage of convenience of new technologies, and that's with RFID scanners. That's radio frequency ID scanners. Many of your credit cards now have a little chip inside them that allows you to just swipe your card instead of sliding your card through the reader to pay for goods and transactions through services. So if you're familiar with the mobile speed pass, it's a similar concept where you'd just be able to wave your credit card in front of the reader device and it would process the transaction up to a fixed amount, typically only $25, $50, or $70. Well, criminals have taken advantage of that, and this tends to happen only in densely populated areas like subways, very dense cities like New York City, San Francisco, locations like that, where they can walk around with a little device in their pocket that just scans for these RFID cards. And if they get within 6 feet of a person and they're able to scan their cards, it actually will download all the information off that person's credit card so that they can take it and sell that data or possibly recreate the credit card. This has led to a whole new industry of identity theft protection wallets and even card sleeves that you can purchase that will block the scanners. You'll see they have all different types of them out there. But a little tip and a little trick that effectively does the same thing, if you've ever seen one, most of them tend to be either aluminum or carbon fiber. Those are two materials that will block these scanners. Well, a little cheap tip that I've been using for quite some time, if you ever have a concern about this, is you can actually just take a little aluminum foil, put it in the billfold of your wallet, so you line the inside of your wallet so it covers your credit cards, and that effectively blocks the signal. Another thing you can do is if you have no need for the swipe capabilities of this scanner in your credit cards, you can actually request to have a card without the RFID chip embedded into it from your credit card company. So again, if you're not sure if you have one, I'd encourage you to reach out, call your credit card companies and ask them about the card that you actually have so you can at least be aware of what your possible exposure is. Going on to another one that happens quite a bit nowadays in the press is data storage, data backup. If anyone's ever had a hard drive failure, a computer crash, a device failure, you can understand the pain of losing your information. So that's where data backup and online backup has become an incredible convenience. And you look at what Apple's done with iCloud and Dropbox and the other companies out there that provide simple, quick access to manage your data online. Well, again, with every great feature comes a little bit of risk. There's also companies that will do it on a scheduled basis. You can also back up your data locally. The tip from my side of the table is you definitely want to back up your data, whether it's just pictures, music files, whatever it is you're using on your device. Having a backup is important so that you don't lose that information should something happen to your device. Local storage is very cheap and easy to purchase now. You can buy external hard drives, small flash drives that contain massive amounts of data capacity. I'm a big fan of those because it lets you manage it locally and gives you the ability to get quick access to it without having it online. Whenever you're going to use an online backup like iCloud or Dropbox, you want to make sure you have some familiarity of what they're doing to protect your information. In most cases, they do use very sophisticated and high levels of data encryption. And I'll give you some examples a little later on to look for. But you want to be mindful of what you put up there. You might not want to store sensitive information like your Social Security number on some of these services if you're not comfortable with the amount of protection they're providing to you. Another area is data disposal. And nowadays, many of us probably look at this when we go to upgrade a computer or a laptop or a smartphone. There's all kinds of companies that will buy your leftover equipment from you for a reasonable fee. And it's a nice feature in the sense that it helps you offset the cost of purchasing new equipment. But again, there's also risk with that because simply deleting a file, it's not truly deleted. If you look into it, you actually need to overwrite the space on the memory in the device 27 times to truly wipe the data from the device, whether that's a hard drive on a desktop, on a laptop, or even on your smartphone. Many smartphones, a lot of us look at possibly trading them in when we go to upgrade, and resetting them to factory defaults does not necessarily remove the data from the device. There are ways that you can go through and wipe the device clean, and I'd encourage you, you want to make sure you understand that you've removed all of your data before you submit it in. There are lots of ways to do it. I'm a big fan of removing the hard drives if you're talking about a desktop or a laptop, regardless of whether you're donating it to a charity, selling it to a reseller, or even giving it to a friend or family member. Nowadays, they can buy a replacement drive very cheap versus having to buy the whole machine, and that way you make sure you destroyed the data that is very sensitive and very personal to you. Physically destroying the drives is one of my favorite ways. You can drill right through the drive and make it Swiss cheese, get a little exercise, have a little fun, and that way you make sure that you've destroyed your data. Again, with smartphones, it can be a little more challenging depending on the device you have. They have sequences where you can wipe the device. Just look up online if it's Apple, if it's Android. They have all instructions on how to delete and reset your device thoroughly to make sure you've removed your data. Passwords are our first line of defense for everything. So if we think of them, right, we use them to access our email, our social accounts, our online bank accounts, our online financial accounts, logging into our computers, all different types of things. Oddly enough, a lot of people tend not to use the best passwords. You'll see on the screen the top 10 most used and worst passwords all at the same time. It really, I find it fascinating that up until last year, password was the number one used password in the world for nearly 30 years. It was only passed in the past year by 123456, which, as you can all agree, is probably not a great password either. But passwords are a challenge. We have to manage many of them. and store them and remember them, and that can be very difficult with the amount of accounts and the amount of systems that we use, but they are critically important to have a quality password. So a couple of tips that I have out there are making sure that you follow some general best practices. Now, I'm sure many of you have talked to different people and may have different advice on passwords, and typically the safest thing you'll hear from folks is to use a random sequence of letters and numbers, varying characters that, frankly, is difficult to remember. But nowadays you'll see that most sites, most accounts, most applications require a minimum of 8 characters. That's really the magic length. That's why all companies have gone to that. A password that's at least 8 characters in length has proven to be very substantially safe in the sense that it's a lot harder to crack. And you do want to have varying characters, but making it not personal but easy to remember. So that's difficult to do. That's why you'll see our tip that I've been using for quite some time now is a little technique called phrasing. So the examples you see up there, I love my 2 dogs with an exclamation point. I had 2 Siberian Huskies. So I have a capital I, a number 2, and an exclamation point at the end. That's a very safe password because not only is it 8 characters plus, it's got uppercase and lowercase, it's got letters and numbers, and a special character. A special character is simply an exclamation point, a question mark, a period, an ampersand. Very, very safe password, incredibly difficult for hackers and scripts to crack, and very easy for me to remember. Most of us can come up with a simple phrase that fits those criteria, gives you the 8-character length, gives you the alphanumeric, the upper lowercase, and the special character, and manage it very effectively. I also like to point out, and something I'm sure most folks have heard before, you don't want to use the same password for all of your accounts. In most cases, you couldn't do it because it wouldn't allow you. So what I suggest to folks is you can come up with at least 3 phrases that will work for many of your accounts. And what that allows you to do is not have hundreds of passwords, but still have safe, quality passwords that are not too difficult to remember. Another thing that I've been using for quite some time are password keeper programs. These are applications that you can use on your smartphone, on your tablet, on your laptop or desktop to manage all of your passwords. They use very sophisticated forms of data encryption to protect your information. You simply create one password, and then you can log in and categorize and store all your usernames, IDs, and passwords for all the different sites and applications you access. Well, of course, that's got a lot of sensitive information in it, so you want to be careful about it. But what these applications do is not only do they scramble your data in a very sophisticated, nearly impossible way to crack, but they also have some sequences in to protect it in case you lose your device or lose your information. They have the ability to set self-destruct sequences, so if someone were to steal your device or you lost it and they tried to log in, you can set it to wipe your information from the device after 3, 5, or even up to 10 failed logins. But as you can imagine, you want to make sure you remember your login for that account so that you can get in and out of it. One that I've been using for a very long time is a program called Keeper. It's a free program. It's available for all different applications, meaning Windows, Apple, Android. You can use it on mobile devices, desktops, and they use military-grade encryption. And I'll explain a little bit more about it, but it's called 512-bit level encryption. Very sophisticated, very safe, something I've been using for nearly a decade and have had great luck with. So again, that keeps you from writing them down on paper and having to go to something that's easily lost and easily stolen. More tips around Wi-Fi. Many of us have Wi-Fi networks that we use at home. They're great, they're simple, they're easy to manage. But what a lot of people tend not to do is put a secure passcode on them. And it's an important thing to do even if you live in a nice neighborhood with neighbors not too close by. And the reason being is you just never know if someone does hop on your network, they can possibly do all kinds of different things. Even if you don't have a lot of sensitive information on there, you could possibly be exposed to people trying to do things that they don't want to do on their home network, their personal network. So setting up a simple PIN again, limits the possibility of that happening. You'll deter the folks from trying things because if they try to get into your network and it's got a secure code to get in there, they'll just go down to the neighbor's house or somebody else's because they know somebody else will have an open, unsecured network. Another thing to be aware of with public Wi-Fi networks is knowing what you're logging into. A common scam that happens nowadays throughout the U.S. and all over the world is that people can set up mock Wi-Fi networks. So, for example, if you've ever been to a Starbucks or a McDonald's, most of them have free Wi-Fi nowadays. What these criminals are doing is they can sit in the parking lot of, let's say, a Starbucks, and they can set up a hotspot. It's something that many people use for business purposes. You can buy a little device from AT&T or Verizon, and it lets you create a portable wireless network. Well, they can set these hotspots up, and they'll usually name them something similar to the location's network. So, for example, Starbucks, many locations, their network may be called Starbucks, or they may have an AT&T network. So if a criminal were to sit in the parking lot, they might call the network Starbucks 1 or Java 2 or something that sounds similar, because people have a tendency, if they see a free Wi-Fi network, they hop right on it. And what these criminals will do is once they see someone log onto their network, they can then try to drop a little keylogger script onto their device, and that'll record every keystroke, every tap, every thumb touch on their device, and hopefully they'll gather some information. So what can you do? Well, a simple trick, a simple technique is just confirming the network name that you're logging into. When they're trying to do this in any location, you can't have networks with the identical name in the same location. So that's why they'll call it a Starbucks 1 or a Java 2 or an AT&T 3. Simply going up to the counter of the merchant that you're at and just asking for the Wi-Fi information, again, greatly reduces your possible risk. Another thing is when you're on public networks, it's a good idea to limit the amount of sensitive information you access. So meaning it may not be the best place to log in to some of your financial accounts, because if someone were to get on your device, they may have the ability to see what you're doing on there. So continue with the deter is, again, around your computers, is managing, maintaining your antivirus, anti-malware software. It's something that most machines come with free initially, but what you tend to have to do is pay for or manage an upgrade service, update service. And that's something that many folks fall short on. But I can stress it is incredibly important to manage and run updates regularly. Almost every single day, there are literally hundreds of different viruses, malware, and malicious scripts that are written out there and then just broadcast out over the web, blasted out through email, trying to get victims. If you're not running the updates, you're greatly increasing your possible exposure of accidentally clicking on an email and then that virus infecting your computer. There's also lots of scams where people try to force viruses onto your machine to take your computer hostage. And by ensuring you run your updates, you can limit the possibility of that happening. All the programs out there are very good, from McAfee to Norton to Spybot to free ones like AVG. All the services, whether you pay for them or you get a free service, are good, but the most important thing is to run the updates regularly. By not doing that, again, you're increasing your possible risk of contracting a virus and someone taking over your machine. Another area where deter is incredibly important has to do with social media. Whether you use it or not, I'm sure you have family and friends members, kids and grandkids that do. And if you look on the screen, more than 50% of all social network profiles have this information on it: people's full names, their date of birth, their home address, their relationship status, schools and graduation dates, pets' names, and other affiliations. And if you think about that information, that tends to be people's security questions for resetting their passwords. Beyond that, many people have a lot of other information that's on their social sites that could give criminals a lot of detail out there to possibly access, hack, or get into your accounts. So it's incredibly important, whether you use them or you have friends or family that use social networks, or any of them, from Facebook to LinkedIn to Twitter to any of the different networks out there, be mindful. Reduce the amount of personal, private information like this that's posted. Another key thing, and this was in the news quite a bit over the last few years, is how you post things. And this is especially important with kids and grandkids. And the example is maybe a son or a grandkid might post, going to Disney World on Tuesday for vacation, going to be gone for 2 weeks. And if you think about what that tells possible criminals, rob my house on Wednesday because no one will be here for 2 weeks. Posting in past tense greatly reduces that. The example being, just got back from Disneyland, had a great time. So again, if you have friends, you have family members, you use it yourself, simple things like that. Posting in past tense. Don't tell people what you're doing till after it's already done is a great thing to do to, again, reduce possible exposure because you just don't know. A lot of people think, even with all your privacy settings that you may have increased, the risk of that information getting out there still exists. These networks are run, and in general, mostly the information is public. A lot of the information is still accessible by Google. If someone were to Google search you, stuff from LinkedIn will pop up, stuff from Facebook will pop up, and then they can try to get into your network. So again, incredibly important. Little things like that make a great difference in your possible exposure. Another area, the second D, detect. And this is an important one, monitoring your information. The most important thing you can do beyond reducing your paper trail is tracking for activity. Googling yourself. It's something everybody should do and do often. Tracking your credit report. If you don't do it regularly already, you should absolutely do it. And I'm not talking about the freecreditreport.com commercials where they do the little dance and sing a little jingle and then charge you some money afterwards. I'm talking about annualcreditreport.com. That's where everybody can go on and get a free copy once a year of their credit report from all three bureaus, TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. It's a very, very crucial thing to do because you can see if someone were to open an account and go delinquent on it on your credit report. And it's a great thing to do, especially for minors and any children you have in the family, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Under the detection, the big scheme that happens here where criminals are taking advantage of folks, and may happen to many of you out there, I know it's happened to myself, it's payment card fraud. It's a technique called skimming. This is behind a lot of the big hacks out there with Target and some of the other companies where criminals will try to get into the devices that read your credit cards, either physically by attaching device or doing it via software like the sophisticated Target hacks. And what will happen is when you go to pay for your goods and services, whether it's at a restaurant, a bar, a merchant, a retailer, when you swipe your card for processing a payment, it'll scan your information, download it to another device, and they'll just collect people's information and then go recreate those credit cards and sell them to other criminals out there to use to process fraudulent transactions. Not surprising, to be honest, the U.S. actually leads the world in credit card fraud, including debit card fraud. And that has a lot to do with the technology of our credit cards today. Frankly, we're using technology from the early 70s, late 60s, and that's the magnetic strips. All of our credit cards, and when we go to pay for it, we just swipe and it goes through. That's a very old technology that doesn't have a lot of protection in place. There will be some changes to that. In Europe and in Canada and other parts of the world, they've actually been using chip technology in the credit cards, and you may start to see this in some of your accounts coming through, that greatly reduces the risk of somebody being able to skim and scam your information. How it works is the merchant has to have a credit card device that can read the chip on your credit card, and when you go to slide it through to process the payment, not only does it check your card and check your account, but it validates that it's a real credit card by authenticating the chip, the microchip that's in your credit card. That's the challenge of why it's not been implemented in the U.S. yet, because not only does it require the credit card companies to update their plastic, it actually requires the merchants to purchase new hardware. Many credit card companies are starting to put time periods on it where they'll no longer process business with merchants that don't have this technology. So you'll see it start to come into place late this year and into next year, where more and more of your credit cards will have this chip technology and more of your merchants will start to have it. So what can you do in the interim? A lot of the skimming scams, especially with the physical devices, can be obvious if you take a little bit of time to look. They put them a lot on ATM machines, and the example I have on the slides on gas pumps. Now the merchants and the retailers have started to put some stuff in place to flag activities when they've happened. So the example on the screen, you may have seen this out there, they'll put special tape around the swipe machines so that if anybody tampers with it, it'll actually show voided on the strip. The other thing is, don't be afraid to look around before you swipe your card, whether it's an ATM or a gas pump. Take a quick look at it before you actually slide it into the machine. Look for something that looks suspicious. If you see a magazine or brochure rack out of place, shake it, take a look at it. Some criminals will actually put little cameras in those devices, so when you go to slide your card in at the ATM machine, not only are they downloading your card number, they're video recording your PINs. So don't be afraid. Take a little extra time before you go to process your cards and evaluate the situation. But most importantly is monitor your activity regularly. Whether you do it online, you look at your statements before you pay the bills, that's the best thing you can do to catch those fraudulent transactions. Because as long as it's a Visa card, a MasterCard, American Express, they all come with 0% fraud liability. And what I mean by that, whether it's a debit card or a credit card, once you've proven it's a fraudulent transaction, by law they're required to recredit the account within 10 business days. That's a federal law. So that's comforting, but think about what I just said. Once you've proven it's a fraudulent transaction, it can be credited in 10 business days. So when it comes to the credit card companies, most of them are very quick. As soon as you call them, discuss the transaction, confirm that you weren't in Europe last week when the transactions were processed or wherever they're alleging the transactions were processed, they usually will credit your account, give you a new card, and send it out to you within a day or two. With your ATM cards, many banks are slowing down that process, and in some cases they may actually require you to go file a police report with your local police station before they will confirm it's a fraudulent transaction. So that's what I mean. Monitoring is incredibly important. You want to make sure you catch it before it goes on for any extended period of time. Any cards beyond Visa, MasterCard, Amex backed, you want to check with the bank or company to understand your liability. It's always a good idea to know what your possible liability is, but you can feel more confident. Most of us use Visa, MasterCard, or Amex, but anything beyond that you certainly want to check into and confirm what your liability is if you have any when it comes to fraudulent transactions. Another big area for detection is email fraud. And with email fraud, it's around phishing. And this is where you might receive an email that's posing as a company, a government entity, trying to scare you into sharing information with them that you normally wouldn't. And these are called phishing scams, where you could possibly receive an email. It'll have headers, logos, and it might have information in the body of the email stating something to the effect, "We've had an issue with your account. We need you to validate XYZ data about your account. Please respond to this email so we can reinstitute your account." The top 3 companies that are targeted with this year in and year out are eBay, PayPal, and the IRS. They do pose as many other companies, but why it's called phishing is they'll blast out these emails to tens of thousands of people and try to get a few responses. Now, there's a few giveaways to this, especially when it comes to the IRS, and that's the IRS does not email the public at all for that type of information. No reputable company will ask you to send sensitive personal information through email unless it's encrypted. Generally speaking, email is not encrypted. So if you get an email that sounds funny and seems funny, it probably is. And it's important not to click on any links, call any phone numbers, or respond to those emails. Even if it is a legitimate request, it doesn't hurt to take a couple extra seconds, maybe a minute or two, call the number you have on file, go to the website that you know that's that company if you have an account with them, and confirm it's an actual need before you do. If you do find something that appears to be a phishing attempt, it's also helpful to notify the company so that they can log it, track it, and see if they can find out where there are any trends or patterns of these type of crimes occurring, so hopefully they can shut it down at different points in time. A couple other areas in detect is website security, and I talked about encryption already. give you more specific examples. When you're logging into a website, you want to make sure that it is a protected website. You can see little indicators on most of them in the address line. If it's a secure site, it should have HTTPS. When it has the S, that means it's a secured site. And many of them, you'll also see the little lock up next to the address bar, again, showing you that it's got encryption. Companies use different types of encryption. They use security certificates, and one that many use that I've already mentioned, bit-level encryption. And the way these work is effectively on the sender side, you have your information. When it passes through the site to be encrypted, they scramble it with one set of keys, and when it gets into the back-end system, it is unscrambled with another set of keys. The only way the hacker would get it is in the middle, and that would just be scrambled data. Without both sets of keys, they're not able to scramble it. Bit-level encryption, just to explain it in simple terms, is just using ones and zeros to scramble your data. The minimum standard used to be 128-bit. What that means is it was 128 ones and zeros that they would use to scramble each character in your information. If you think about that, simple math, that equates to 2.9 trillion sets of codes that they would use. That was the old standard. The new standard is 256. So now we're up to 6 trillion sets of codes. And before I mentioned Keeper, the password program that can protect your passwords for you, that uses military-grade encryption. They use 512-bit level encryption. So now we're up to 12 trillion sets of codes. Very, very difficult to crack. I actually have not read or seen any confirmation that that's actually been cracked out there that's been validated. So again, just having a little understanding when you're logging into a website, you can click on the little lock and actually see what type of protection they have. So if they're using bit level, it'll tell you they're using 128 or 256. If they're using security sockets and security certificates, it'll give you an indication of what they're doing. At least this way, you can have some sense of security knowing that they're protecting your information. Last area on detect before we get to the final D is around tax return fraud. And this is a huge crime that's increased tremendously over the last few years. And this is where thieves will process fraudulent returns to get a payout from the IRS. Staggering is the only thing I can use to describe the amount of money that's been stolen in the last few years. You look at $4 billion in 2014, and that's over a 60% increase to 2013. They don't actually have to have your full details to process it, but they do have to have a lot of your information. They need your Social Security number, your name and address, and usually what they'll do, even if, let's say, you weren't supposed to receive a return, they will put in fake numbers to get a return. And the criminals have a little bit of intelligence on this side, and why they've been so successful is the fact that they will stay under common triggers, meaning that they'll ensure that the fake returns they're putting through don't exceed $9,000 because that triggers a flag at the IRS. So they'll usually process them so that they're $3,000, $4,000, and $5,000. So what can you do? The most important and the best thing you do is file before the criminals do, right? File early. Because once they filed a fraudulent return, you won't really find out until you go to process your taxes. Whether you are getting a return or not, you'll then be notified that the tax return has already been processed on your behalf, and it can be a lengthy process to unwind. Ensure that you know your tax preparer if you use a service, if you're not doing them yourselves. And also, again, going back to the mail, reduce and don't send them through your mailbox. It actually is very safe and much faster to do it electronically. Putting in your mailbox just leaves it exposed. There's also been many cases where people would just steal the paperwork out of the mail and then go change the returns and file them online. Again, if you're following many of the tips that we've mentioned throughout the program, it'll greatly reduce your exposure to this type of crime because they do need your Social Security number. They do need your full name, your address, enough details so they can actually put through a return. So if you're taking some of the practices and tips that we've given you, it will reduce your possible exposure here. But again, the biggest thing to do is get it in early, get it in as soon as you can, get it in before the criminals. So the last D, and that's defend. Now we've got to take action. There are several things you can do once you've found a fraudulent activity or some exposure that you've had. Fraud alerts are a great thing. You can apply these to your credit bureaus because in most cases, if they want to open an account and go after you, they need to access your credit. You can put fraud alerts for 90 and up to 180 days at all 3 credit bureaus, and that puts a hold on your credit being released until it's been authenticated by you. Also, closing old accounts. That's an important thing. If there's no reason to leave those open accounts stagnant if you're not using them. Close them down slowly and systematically so that they're no longer a potential risk. And also, taking advantage of some of the resources out there. A fantastic website is the FTCgov. On there, they have lots of information. They have great tips and the top 10 things to do when you've had an exposure. Things like notify the company, change your passwords, file a police report depending on the extent of the crime, and all the specifics around how to do things like place fraud alerts, credit freezes, the different things that you can do out there to, again, take action once something's occurred. Another great website is idtheft.gov. They have all state and federal laws up there, so you can get an understanding of what the government has in place to help protect you, especially once something's occurred. But again, with every big risk is another side of it, is an opportunity. And there's been a whole slew of identity theft protection services out there that have grown tremendously over the last decade. They really come down to 2 sides of it, prevention and post-issue occurrence. Most of them, like LifeLock and TripleT, the ones you've probably seen in the TV commercials and on the billboards, are prevention services. They do a lot of the things that you can do yourselves for a fee and on your behalf. Stuff like monitoring your cards, monitoring your credit reports, tracking your accounts. But they also do some things that are a little more difficult for most people to do, and that's to scan the web and look for your personal information and try to pull it down. But again, that's very much on the prevention side of the table. They're going to flag you either prior or when something happens. There are a lot of other services that are more like insurance policies so that if you have something occur, they will help you try to unwind it. Everything from helping you file the reports, getting the information you need, and all the details to try to hopefully reverse the fraud that's occurred. So with that, again, we're going to focus on the 3 Ds. It's important to safeguard that personal information, reduce that paper trail, shred those documents before they end up in the trash, and limit what's carried around on your person. You want to do the second D and detect your activity. That's monitoring your accounts on a regular basis, whether it's daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly. You want to make sure you have a routine where you track all of your different accounts so you can catch the fraudulent activity before it grows too large. And then the last D, we're going to defend. We're going to take action when something's happened. You want to make sure you notify the company, inform them of what's gone through, file a police report if necessary, change your password, and take action so you can limit the losses there. So with that, that's the end of my formal comments here. I'm going to turn it back over to Justin for just a second so we can wrap up with some questions.
Yeah, sure. Ted, thank you again. I know identity theft is a hot-button issue, and really thank you again for sharing the valuable tips into protecting your privacy. So with that, I would love to open up the floor to the audience, to our clients, to go ahead and feel free, just ask any questions over the phone to Ted that you may have. We also have a chat feature on the WebEx site as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to type in via the chat or over the phone, and we'll go ahead and we'll open that up now.
Any questions? Sure.
All right. Diana, thank you for your feedback. No questions at the time, and I agree, Diana. Great information tonight. All right, so no questions coming in at this time. Ted, I don't know if you had any follow-up, any final closing questions. We'll certainly leave a couple more minutes here. But if you had any closing remarks, Ted.
Sure.
we'll go from there.
Yeah, so just a couple, again, reiterations. The biggest thing that I've seen over the years where I've had exposure myself personally has come with paper. So I can't stress enough how important it is to reduce that mail, reduce your paper even in your household, because inadvertently, whether it's accidental, intentional, whatever the case may be, it's very easy for stuff to end up in the trash. Another important one is if you're ever at the hospital, unfortunately, whether if you've happened to find yourself at the ER, at a doctor's office, take a look around. The medical industry is still, or the healthcare industry is still one that is slowly moving away from leveraging your Social Security number. I personally was in the ER for what I thought was a broken bone about 7 months ago, and I noticed on my wristband it had my Social Security number on it. And when I was checking out of the ER, they cut it off and threw it in the trash. I wasn't too happy about that. So be mindful. You know, the biggest thing you can do is just be aware of your surroundings, especially when it comes to that paper. You know, if you know your personal information is out there in a scenario like that, you know, take a look and make sure you destroy it. Ask them to destroy it. You know, take control of it yourself when and where you can, because it's one of the biggest risks that everybody has out there. And again, you know, focus on the three areas. You know, that's the first one. That's the deterring by taking action, reduce that paper, and second one being detecting and monitoring, you know, tracking your account activity. In most cases, if you do find a fraudulent transaction on one of your bank accounts or credit accounts, you usually won't lose money, but it may be held up for a while. So the sooner you catch it, the sooner it's reversed. You know, 10 days can be a long time when you think about 10 business days. That could be 2+ weeks depending on what holidays are going on and how long it takes to validate the fraudulent transaction. So those are some of the things I always like to reinforce. And again, if you have questions, things come up, definitely leverage those two websites I mentioned, FTCgov and IDtheft.gov. There are a wealth of information out there around common trends and things that they're seeing pop up that you may not be aware of, that may not make it to the local news or even the national news. So it's a good way to stay aware of the things that are occurring so you can determine what you want to do to make sure you safeguard your information.
That's great, Ted. Thank you again for the information. I know everyone certainly found it valuable. And we did have one final question come in about receiving a copy of the presentation. Now, I know that we will be sending out the webinar electronic version of this, so you'll be able to watch the webinar at any time. And we'd also be happy to send the Prudential presentation out as well. And again, if anyone has any follow-up questions, you know, you go to bed tonight and have a follow-up question that you'd like to ask, feel free to send those my way, and I will certainly communicate those with Ted if need be.
Great.
All right. So if that is all, and I think that's all the questions from everybody, we'll go ahead and we'll close this out. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I know this was a great presentation that Ted was able to give to us. And Ted, thank you again.
Very good.
Thank you again. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Round of applause. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Have a great night. Ted, thank you. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night.